17 nations just signed something Washington had been trying to get done for 30 years. 5 refused. And what separates the 17 who showed up from the 5 who stayed home tells a bigger story than most people realize. On March 5th, 2026, at Southcom headquarters in Doral, Florida, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth signed the America's Counter-Cartel Conference Joint Security Declaration alongside 17 partner nations. The Bahamas, Belize, Dominican Republic, Guyana, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Ecuador, Paraguay, and Peru. Each one pledged to expand multilateral and bilateral cooperation on border security, counter transnational criminal organizations, secure critical infrastructure, and join a coalition with one purpose: dismantle these hemispheric threats once and for all. Hegseth was direct. America is prepared to take on these threats and go on the offense alone, if necessary. However, it is our preference that we all do it together, with our neighbors and our allies who are eager and willing and capable. This isn't a committee. It isn't another summit photo op. It's a command structure. 2 days later, President Trump convened the inaugural Shield of the Americas Summit at Trump National Doral, Miami. 12 partner heads of state showed up in person. Trump's framing was blunt. The only way to defeat these enemies is by unleashing the power of our militaries. No hedging, no 30 years of further study. But the region's heavyweights, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, and Canada, did not sign. Mexico's President Sheinbaum said her country would continue handling organized crime through its own law enforcement. Brazil cited sovereignty. Colombia pointed to existing bilateral deals. Venezuela's government called the coalition a unilateral venture. Canada said no combat without a UN mandate. Reasonable positions, the same positions, roughly, that have been held for 3 decades. Here's what 3 decades of those positions produced. Over 100,000 American lives lost each year at peak from synthetic opioids alone. Families affected in every zip code in the country. Criminal organizations with revenues rivaling mid-cap multinationals. Illicit corridors operating for 20 years across the same borders. Over $1 billion in U.S. aid to Latin American training, border support, and cooperation frameworks. The same frameworks, roughly, that have been running for 30 years. Entire towns along the southwestern border turned into transit zones. Rural communities losing a generation to a crisis nobody in the old framework could stop. Sometimes the numbers speak for themselves. Now, here's the part that matters. 2 months before the declaration was signed, Washington already demonstrated what it could do alone. January 3rd, 2026, Operation Absolute Resolve. U.S. Special Forces moved on a residence in Caracas, took the Venezuelan leader and his wife into custody, transferred them to the USS Iwo Jima before sunrise, and had them in federal custody in New York by the end of the day. Charges: leading a criminal enterprise designated by the U.S. as a terrorist organization, specifically the Cartel de los Soles, named for the sun symbol on Venezuelan military uniforms. According to the superseding indictment, the Venezuelan leadership had facilitated the movement of tons of illicit product into the United States over more than a decade. That was the predicate. That was what made the capture a law enforcement action, not a foreign policy adventure. Critics immediately invoked international law. Others compared it to the 1989 Panama intervention and the capture of Manuel Noriega, who, like the Venezuelan leader, was a sitting head of state indicted on U.S. charges. Noriega lost every legal challenge he made. He served 40 years. The precedent was set 3 decades ago. A sitting head of state removed from his own capital, standing before a federal judge within 48 hours. 2 months later, 17 nations signed the declaration. That sequence isn't a coincidence. That sequence is the argument. The results started landing almost immediately. Operation Southern Spear, the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific Maritime Campaign, has been running since September 2025. Smuggling routes that operated openly for 20 years now get intercepted within hours of leaving port. In February, a joint U.S.-Colombia operation seized 10 tons of illicit cargo from a semi-submersible in international waters, worth $441 million, destroyed on the spot. In April, Joint Interagency Task Force South intercepted more than 2 tons more in the Eastern Pacific. In Ecuador, U.S.-supported operations on criminal infrastructure began March 3rd. Pentagon officials told the House Armed Services Committee this is just the beginning. Their phrase, not mine. The Caribbean, once the main artery for illicit product heading north, is becoming a dead end. Vessels that try their luck meet joint patrols from Ecuador, Panama, and U.S. Navy assets before they clear their own coastline. Seizures at the southern border have dropped sharply. Preventable deaths in multiple U.S. states are falling for the first time in a decade. New approach, different results, not complicated. The American public saw it coming. A Harvard Cap/Harris poll found 71% of Americans backed the deployment of U.S. military force against these organizations, including 56% of Democrats. That's not a partisan issue. That's an American one. Now here's what doesn't get discussed as often. China's footprint across this hemisphere has grown quietly for more than a decade. Billions of dollars in belt and road investments are parked in ports across Panama, Ecuador, and the Caribbean. Chinese-built cranes handle cargo by day. Chinese-built surveillance infrastructure watches the docks by night. Data flows to Beijing. Venezuela was China's largest Western Hemisphere oil customer until January 3rd. The day before the strike, the Venezuelan leader was meeting with a Chinese delegation in Caracas. State television broadcast the handshakes. 24 hours later, he was on a U.S. warship headed to New York. Panama withdrew from Belt and Road last year under direct U.S. pressure, including a review of long-term port contracts, some of them running 30 and 40 years, held by a Hong Kong-based operator. Every port the coalition secures is a port Beijing loses access to. Ecuador hosts an FBI office now. It didn't 2 years ago. This isn't only about illicit trade. It's about who controls the supply chains, who owns the minerals, who monitors the shipping lanes, and who decides what moves through the canal. It's worth asking why 4 of the 5 countries that refuse to sign have significant Chinese investment exposure. The story tells itself. In the weeks after the March signing, something interesting happened. Colombia's government reopened bilateral cooperation channels with Washington after a high-profile meeting between Presidents Petro and Trump, the same meeting that produced the February 10-ton seizure. Mexico continued its public rejection of joint operations, but U.S.-Mexico coordinated action in the Eastern Pacific seized several tons off Clarion Island, an operation the Mexican Navy itself announced. Public posture and operational reality aren't always the same thing. Venezuela's new interim government is now coordinating with Washington on oil exports, $5 billion in expected sales over the coming months, according to the U.S. Secretary of Energy. The landscape everyone knew in December of last year doesn't exist anymore. 17 nations drew a line. 5 stayed home. The ones who showed up are running operations, taking targets into custody, cutting illicit corridors, rebalancing influence in their own hemisphere. And for the first time in a generation, the numbers are moving in the right direction. The ones who stayed home are defending an arrangement with a measurable track record. That's not 2 foreign policy philosophies. That's 2 different outcomes. And for the American families who spent the last 30 years watching the old approach deliver little but funerals, the calculation is simple: results or excuses. The question now, do the remaining 5 eventually fold? Or is the hemisphere splitting in 2? Drop your read in the comments.